Hello and welcome to Cup of Cosmology, the place for all your questions about the universe. My name is Deanna Hooper, Charlie to friends, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher based at the University of Helsinki over in Helsinki in Finland, and I'm a cosmologist doing a postdoc. And that means that I study the universe, the contents of the universe, how things evolve, how things interact. It's really fun. I really generally do love being a scientist. I love being a cosmologist, and I love chatting to everybody about all of the cool things I get to work on. For anyone who doesn't yet know, the idea of Cup of Cosmology is this is an interactive stream. You people can ask me anything you want about space, about physics, about cosmology, about academia. And in fact, academia is going to be exactly the topic of discussion today. So before we get into that, if you haven't done so yet, please do subscribe, leave a comment, like the video, say hello, tell me where you're watching from. Always nice to have people chatting and interacting, else I just feel like I'm a villain monologuing here. I see we already have some of the regulars coming in. We have Prath, Scott, Arlo. Great to see you all, as always. If you're a regular, welcome back. If you're a first-time viewer, welcome. This is a heavy stream to jump into if you're a first-time viewer, but hopefully it's going to be fun. Hey, Ange, great to see you as well. I know we have a bunch of people here. Hey, Sophia, nice to see you. James, great to see you. All of the regulars coming in, as always. Very, very nice to see everybody here. So today we do have a special topic. Some weeks this is an Ask Me Anything, literally Ask Me Anything. Today there is a special topic that I want to talk about. I just see there's a comment from Prathia. Before you start the main topic, did you find anything on charged black holes from last time? I did not. I did my usual thing of make a note of it and then finish the stream and put my notepad away. And I just got my notepad out from the cupboard again like 3 minutes ago. And I saw a note saying, look up charged black holes. And I was like, oh, yes, that's something I was supposed to do. So yes, things being written down on the notebook does not necessarily mean things will actually happen, because this notebook, this like little note paper, fresh page today, gets put away at the end of the stream and doesn't reappear until next week. This is my streaming notebook. At some point, I'll go through and address all of the open questions, but not today. So today I want to talk about academia, the ivory tower, as it's often very pretentiously called. Now, academia is this whole body around science, but not just science, around any university, any institution of knowledge, the way we go about gaining this knowledge, the way universities and institutions impart this higher education, this whole thing is what we call academia. And I want to talk about the goods and the bads of academia. So I'm going to add some disclaimers before we get started. So the first one is that I know that every job, every field has good and bad things. This is not in any way intended as me being like, oh, woe is us scientists, we have the worst job. This is not what my intention is here. You know, every job has good things, every job has bad things. My intention behind this stream is I feel like there are some things about academia that are sometimes a bit obscure, sometimes not really well advertised. And I feel like there's often a disconnect between academia and, as a lot of people say, the real world, because academia really is in its own bubble sometimes, for good and for bad, as we'll discuss today. But I feel like there's some things about academia that are not really as talked about as they should be. And the purpose of the stream today is to just really discuss like why we go into academia in the first place, the things we like and the things we don't like about academia, the things that are good, the things that are bad, the things that work, the things that should be worked on and need to be improved. So this is an open discussion. As always, you can ask me any questions or comments. If you disagree with anything I say, please let me know as well. You know, this is a lot of these streams are like, here's the latest in science, here's the latest in cosmology, here's stuff that we work on. Whereas today, it's really my opinions. Some of the things I'm going to tell you are obviously based on facts, but this is very much my biased perspective. Disclaimer number 2 or 3, however you want to count this, I'm going to be talking from my experience, which is as a scientist in academia. Now, academia doesn't just include scientists. Anyone getting a university degree, anyone working at university is part of academia. So while I'm giving the perspective as a scientist in academia, there will be some things that are very applicable to everyone in academia in general, and some things that are very specific to my field. So I do not mean to talk for everybody here. This is very much my own experience and observations based on 15 years in academia. So this is my thoughts 15 years in, and why I'm still here 15 years in. Question from Emma here, not sure if it's a real question, But apparently the cat started screaming as soon as I started talking. That is fair. I get that. You know, your cats are allowed to scream. And I appreciate knowing that there are cats watching me. That is always a nice thing to know. So before I get started with good and bad of academia, again, you can ask me questions at any point if you're an academic and you think there's something I've forgotten to mention here. Please do mention it in the comments as well. You know, interactive stream, you can always jump in with questions or comments, whatever you want. Before I get started, I want to give a bit of background as to where I'm coming from, so what my current situation is. So, hi, I'm a postdoc. This is how I start pretty much every stream. So, I've been in academia for 15 years. And what I'm counting here is I did an undergrad. So I did my bachelor's. This took 5 years because I was working some of the time, so I slowed down my studies. So I spent 5 years doing a bachelor's in Spain. Then I moved to Germany and I spent 2 years working on my master's degree in astroparticle physics and cosmology. Then I stayed in Germany at the same institute to do my PhD in cosmology, early universe cosmology. This was in Germany. Then by the time I finished my PhD, I'd been in academia for 10 years. So that was 5 of the undergrad, 2 of the bachelor's, 3 of the PhD, because Germany was very strict. It's 3 years, you do not have 1 day longer. Then I did my first postdoc in Brussels, which was a 2-year postdoc. And I'm just finishing the 3rd year of my postdoc in my second postdoc in Helsinki. So this brings me to 15 years. Now, what is a postdoc? This is going to be important. So a postdoc is this kind of in-between stage where I have a PhD, I finish my studies, but I'm not yet a professor or an assistant professor or a lecturer, which means I'm on a temporary contract. So a postdoc is a temporary position that is usually for between 2 and 3 years and often involves going to a different university to do the next postdoc. Now, some of you have been following me for a while, and some of you know that my job situation has been a bit precarious, basically for the last few years because of academia. But one thing that I do want to mention, just to really set the scene of where I am. A couple of weeks ago, actually a week ago, I signed a 1-year contract to stay in Helsinki. Basically, still being a postdoc, but with a slightly different job description. I'm going to be changing focus slightly. I'm super excited about it. And it does mean that I have a job for 1 more year, which is nice. I get to stay in Finland for 1 more year, and I'm really, really happy about this. So I'm talking to you today as someone who is on a temporary contract and currently has one year and 2 months of employment left on my temporary contract. As to what comes after that, that is still up for debate, but that is where I'm coming from today. So this is just to set the scene of where I'm coming from and my experiences. So I've worked in 4 different countries. Well, I studied in Spain, and then I've worked in Germany, in Belgium, and in Finland. And while every group is different, every university is different, and every country is different, academia is basically the same wherever you go. And that's going to be one of the topics today. Comment from James here. Does academia include your experiences with writing papers and getting feedback on papers? It absolutely does. So part of being a scientist or part of being in academia involves writing papers. And that is also something that I am going to talk about today. There's a question from Shawnee here. Do you know what universities or colleges that focus on cosmology, astrophysics, or quantum mechanics? I mean, there's many. In most countries, there's several universities that will focus on these different topics. So that's quite a broad question. If you want to discuss more about specific universities in specific countries, send me a message, send me an email, contact@cupofcosmology.com. But in general, a lot of universities will have a cosmology or an astrophysics program or quantum mechanics because they're very interesting and kind of hot topics. Okay, question from Press. How long can you stay a postdoc before you have to do something else? That is a good question. And hold that question, hold that thought. I'm going to get to that. That is one of the things I want to get to. So I'll come back to that. If I don't answer you soon, Press, ask me again. Ask me in like 5 minutes. I will get to that question. Okay, so I want to get started with why we go into academia or why we go into science. And here I can only talk about my own personal experience and my own expectations when I went into academia. Now, I've always loved science from a young age. I've been very much interested in science and very much interested in knowledge and in learning more about things in general. One of my first phrases was "What's that?" I was just walking around pointing at things. What's that? What's that? What's that? What's that? At some point, I realized that if I wanted to get answers to the more questions, one way to do that was going into university, because then I could get good education, good training to actually be able to answer these questions. So, really, one of the main reasons that I went into science was to be able to find answers to questions, to be able to try to figure out how the world works, how the universe works, to be able to look at the world and say, like, I understand that thing. I might not understand everything, but that one little thing over there, I understand. And I can explain that one little thing, that one little niche. But also, I went into science because it feels like a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself. It's kind of like the whole scientific process, the whole mission, the whole idea of learning more about a topic so that other people can then push it even further and even further. It kind of feels like expanding general knowledge where we all push in individual directions, but then together we're building this big landscape of knowledge. And then the next generation will push further. And being part of that sounds like an amazing idea. This was personally my motivations for going into academia, into science, because I wanted to be able to ask these random questions and work on figuring out these random questions. Now, this is basically what I still do often. As a scientist, I ask questions and I try to figure out the answer to them. And sometimes the answer to them involves picking up a book and reading what somebody else has done. And sometimes nobody knows the answer, and then we get to try to figure it out ourselves, which is an amazing feeling. But this is not going to last, don't worry. I have tea with me today. So the cough will go as soon as I drink my tea. This is all good today. Okay. So then there's a question of, do I get to answer the questions that I want to work on? And this is where we get to the first drawback of academia, of being a scientist in academia. That no matter how much I might have specific questions that I want to work on, at the end of the day, I'm going to work on what I'm paid to work on. My funding currently comes from my supervisor, and my supervisor's funding comes from a grant, for an example, or from other places, but in general. So there is always kind of an idea behind the questions you're asking, right? So if I were on my own grant, then yes, this is something where I put in writing, like, I'm going to work on this research question, and the grant is to work on this research question. So then what I'd work on has to be related to this research question. Now, especially the more junior you are in your academic career, the more likely it is that you're working on somebody else's questions. When we start as bachelor students or as master students, sometimes there is some creative input. Sometimes you can say, like, hey, I kind of want to go in that direction. But often what happens at bachelor's and master's levels is people put a list of topics. Like, I need somebody to work on these 5 topics. Do you want to work on them? And then there's kind of this idea that the questions you're trying to answer are somebody else's questions, which is, we have to start somewhere. Nobody starts their first undergrad and they're like, I have the best questions, I'm going to answer these questions. We all start research by working with other people and for other people. But that does mean that the questions we're answering are not necessarily the ones we want to answer. And as you progress in your career, usually you have more and more input in the direction that your research goes into or what you can work on. But then there is another limiting factor, which is the whole grant application process. Now, the problem with grants is there's not many of them. There's not a lot of funding going around. Funding agencies, while they do like new, innovative, amazing concepts that are going to revolutionize the field, they also don't want to randomly throw money at things that are not fruitful. So when you start out on your own research topic and you apply for a grant, like, I'm going to work on this, there's a balance that needs to be struck between convincing people that this is a viable thing to do, but at the same time, this is new and innovative and worth the money. Sometimes projects might seem very worthwhile, but the grant funding agencies might not think they're worthwhile. And at the end of the day, these decisions are usually made by other scientists. There will be a panel of scientists who will review the grant application. And if those scientists reviewing the grant application don't like the topic you've proposed, it's unlikely to get funded. So while when we write grant applications, we do have the freedom, the creative input to write whatever grant proposal we want. If I were to write a grant proposal saying, I'm going to look for dragons living in space, probably no one's going to fund this, and probably because it's unfounded. But that often means that we play this game when we're writing grant proposals of what's the question I actually want to answer? And how can I make this sound like something the grant agency should invest their money into? And this is something that is often seen in the field where when a topic gains a lot of traction, when a topic is interesting, like a few years ago, we had a detection of gravitational waves, and suddenly there was a boost of projects being funded to work on gravitational waves because it's new, it's interesting. But that also means that, anytime you fund one project, it's at the expense of other projects that don't get funded. And one point of criticism that some people have thrown at the whole grant application process is how many grants do we fund on one topic, despite it being a new and interesting idea, at the expense of perhaps not diversifying the research field as much. So this is the whole process here of making the questions you want to answer actually in a way that they can be funded. So while being a scientist means working on amazing questions, sometimes they're not the questions you want to work on. As you progress more and more in your career, as you gain more and more independence, you can have more creative input. And this also very much depends on who you're working with, which we're going to come back to later as well, the whole ideas of working with people or for people. And I'm deliberately doing the with people and for people, and you'll see why later. But, when I started my PhD, there was a proposal behind my PhD. There was a grant proposal that was written mainly by my PhD advisor. But I had a lot of creative input in that. I was asked, what do you want to do your PhD on? And we built the application together, which means that I had a lot of say in what questions I was answering during my PhD. And that is not a general situation. Often at the PhD level, you work on what you're told to work on. So this is kind of like, I decided today I'm not doing list of good things, list of bad things. I'm kind of just waffling, rambling. There is a structure. There is a narrative here, but it's like showing the ups and downs. The ups is we get to work on very cool questions. The down is it's not necessarily the questions we want to work on. But I want to focus more on this whole grant application process and what this means. And this is going to come back to the question of what is a postdoc, how the whole job market in academia works. So when we go into academia, there is often the thought that if you complete your master's, you'll get accepted into a PhD program if you want to. If you do a PhD, you'll get accepted into a postdoc. And if you do a postdoc, 1 or 2 postdocs later, you'll get a permanent position. This is the plan, right? This is the goal. This is what we go in believing. However, there is the problem that every time you progress in your career stage, there are fewer and fewer positions available. So often groups will have multiple master students, a few PhDs, a handful of postdocs, and a couple of seniors, because most professors will supervise more than one master student or more than one PhD student. And then it's just a number game. Like if one professor has 2 postdocs, 5 master students, 5 PhD students, what happens? How do you get those 5 PhD students when there's only 2 postdoc positions? What's going to happen to the other 3? What's going to happen to those 2 postdocs? Are they aiming to replace that professor? So every time we progress in the academic career, there are fewer and fewer positions available. And this leads to many highly trained people who are not going to find jobs in the field that they're trained to work in. This is something that becomes more and more apparent the longer you stay in academia. So Prath asked me just now, how long can you stay as a postdoc before you have to do something else? There is no upper limit. There is really no upper limit. So a postdoc is usually a 2 or 3 year position. And the idea is you gain more and more research experience until you have enough experience to be a group leader or to be an assistant professor or an associate professor or a full professor. How long does this in-between stage last? There is no fixed time limit on this. I am currently about to start my 6th year of postdoc. I know people who have done 10 years of postdoc. I know someone who got a permanent position 6 months out of his PhD. This is very rare. This is not a common thing to happen, but it can occasionally. So the amount of postdocs you do very much depends on if you want to keep doing postdocs and if you find a permanent position. There is no upper limit. I could be a postdoc for the rest of my life if I kept finding new postdoc positions. The problem with postdoc positions is they are short term. And usually when you finish one position, there is the expectation that you're going to move to a different group. And this is often because people might have funding for 3 years. So for an example, a person might be able to hire a postdoc for 3 years. The end of those 3 years, that money runs out. So then usually you have to move to somewhere else. In my case, when I finished my bachelor's, I moved to Germany. I did my master's. When I did my master's degree, there were 4 of us doing our master's degree with the same teacher, with the same supervisor. There was 1 PhD position with him. I was very fortunate that PhD position was mine. The other 3 had to move group. They had to go somewhere else. But then it's also the same. Like if my PhD advisor had 1 postdoc position that year, he hired me. This also means he's not going to hire any of the other people that had to go somewhere else. So if everyone hires 1 of their master students as a PhD, 1 or 2, depending on the funding, there is a number imbalance here. You're going to have more master students than PhD students. So some master students choose to leave at the end of their masters, which is a perfectly valid decision. Some master students leave because they don't find a PhD position. When I applied for my first postdoc, I applied for 30 positions. I got 2 interviews and I got 1 offer, which I accepted because it was actually a position that I really wanted. But every time we do this, there is the expectation that we're going to move group, that we're going to move country. So while I could be a postdoc forever if I keep finding places that will hire me, every time it's going to be a short-term contract with no long-term guarantee that when this postdoc ends, there's the next job. And the added implication that I would probably have to move country when I finish my next postdoc. This is not a sustainable system. And then going from postdoc to professor, there's even fewer positions available. Every year there's probably a handful of permanent positions opening up across the world. And then if you add things like, I am now very sure that I never want to leave Finland. So if I want a permanent position in academia, I'm hoping that at some point a permanent position is going to open up while I'm still at the right timeline to apply for this permanent position in Finland. Of course, I could relax this and say, okay, I'll take a permanent position in any country and just keep doing postdocs until I find a permanent position in some country, whether it's the one I want to live in or not. This is a decision we all have to make. But there's also the thing that a lot of places see the idea of the more senior you are in a postdoc, then people start asking the question like, well, why haven't you found a permanent position yet? There are, in fact, a lot of postdoc positions that will put a disclaimer of only applicants who are within 5 years of defending their PhD. This is also true for grant applications. So another option, if you don't want to do the whole postdoc application thing, another option is to try to find your own funding. There are several different ways this can happen. There are some international calls, like the European Union puts on calls for massive grants that if you get this grant, you can basically go to any university like, hey, I'm bringing money, hire me for a couple of years while I bring money. And other places will have grants tied to specific countries. So Finland has a grant system within Finland, the UK has its own, Germany has its own. So then you might choose to apply for a grant, because then if you have a grant, you're not reliant on other people's funding. And then we get into the whole thing of many, many people applying for grants and not many positions and not many grants. Most grants have a success rate of around 10 to 15%. So only 10 to 15% of the people applying for these grants actually get them. So if there's not many postdoc positions and there's not many grants, then there's a question of what happens to the people who don't get these positions. And the answer is they either choose to leave because the job precarity is, or for all the other reasons, for any reason they choose to leave, or they are forced to leave because they don't find the next position. And I know several very, very good people who left academia because they didn't find the next position, or because they decided they had constraints, like I want to stay in one country where my family is, and it becomes harder and harder to get positions. Most of the grants that I've applied for in the past have a stipulation of when you're this many years out of your PhD, you can no longer apply. So the longer you stay in the postdoc situation, the harder it becomes to get something more long-term with some margin, right? Because you might do 2, 3, 4 postdocs and then get a permanent position. You might do 2, 3, 4 and then not. There is no guarantee. So then going back to the question, Brett, of how long, is there an upper limit for how long can you stay a postdoc before you have to do something else? It comes back to the question of how long would you want to stay in the situation of not having any long-term guarantee? Because there's no promise of like, if you do 10 years of postdoc, you get a permanent position. It doesn't work like that. There's no such guarantee, there's no such promise. So however much you want to spend in the academic system, there is never any guarantee that you can make that end goal, that you can reach a permanent position if that is the end goal. It is never a guarantee. So you can do as many years of postdoc as you want, but it's a choice. How long do you want to stay in that situation? This also leads to another thing, that if every couple of years we have to apply for new positions or apply for new grants, what is our objective over these few years? Like, while we're doing a 3-year postdoc or a 2-year postdoc, what is the objective? Is the objective still to do good science, to answer the questions that you want to answer? Or is the objective to get your CV good enough for the next position, hoping that the next position might be permanent? And this leads very much to the idea that often we have to focus more on our CV, on improving our chances of getting a permanent position. And then we kind of postpone working on our own topics because we might have to, or working on those questions that we really want to answer, because we have to focus on the next position, on the next grant. A lot of these grants have requirements of publications, or a lot of these positions will look at publications. And here there are people who look at quality, there are people who look at quantity. But at the end of the day, you need your results out there. If the science you do is not published anywhere, how do people know you did it? So then this builds into this idea of having to publish papers. And I'll come back to that because I see there's a question here from James. Are all these positions in educational organizations? What about government opportunities, European Space Agency? Excellent question. So there are many, many different options. In general, a lot of postdoc positions are associated with universities or research centers in general. The European Space Agency, NASA, they have a yearly call for fellowships. These fellowships are basically somewhere in between a grant and a postdoc, where you get, if you get a fellowship, you will go and work there for 2 or 3 years. So there are these postdoc temporary positions also in government institutions, like the European Space Agency, like NASA. There are some usually associated to some research institute, like obviously CERN is going to hire a lot of people, Fermilab is going to hire a lot of people. But it is still the same idea that it's going to be a temporary position until you get the permanent position, if you get it. Also, what I'm saying is my experience in theoretical physics. I know that some people in experimental physics have very different experiences, but some of the general principles are very, very similar. Comment from David Dunn here. I was a full-time postdoc for 3 years at Berkeley until I had to get a full-time job elsewhere. This is when I got my teaching job at Sierra College. Yeah, so, and you did still work at Berkeley in the summers for 14 years. Yeah, so sometimes your postdocs ends because you found a permanent job. Sometimes your postdocs ends because you decide you no longer want to do that, or because you realign your priorities and you decide, like, I actually, this is the job I want, and that's perfectly fine. So the postdoc ends either when you want it to end or when external factors force it to end, which I guess are the only 2 options for anything in general. So coming back to the idea of the papers, the publications, science is not a series of eureka moments. It's not paper, 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 paper. Oftentimes, projects will take many years. There will be setbacks. Projects can take 2, 3, 4 years. The longest project I've worked on took 4 years and 6 months. And now it's going to be beaten by another project that I've had ongoing also for 4 years. So some projects take a long time. My quickest project, on the other hand, was 3 weeks. It was an absolute chaotic rush. We saw a paper, we had an idea, and we were like, literally anyone can do this. We just need to get it out first. 3 weeks later, we had the paper out. That is not the common thing. But yeah, David, then your postdoc ended, and then you had to get a real job. Yeah, because yes, this is the way it works. I do appreciate your comment, Prath, here that if you get a fellowship, you have to go to a volcano and destroy a ring. Honestly, I'm sure there are grant proposals to go study volcanoes. They probably don't involve destroying a ring. But honestly, if I was a volcanologist, I would absolutely throw a ring in a volcano just for the sake of it, which is probably why it's a good thing that I'm not a volcanologist. Also, because if I studied volcanoes, I would actually absolutely go and poke the lava because it looks so fun. To not poke lava, this is not a thing you should do. So, the topic of papers. If a project takes 2 or 3 years, but after 3 years you need to show progress and get a new job, how do you do this? So this often leads to the situation where people might either put out multiple papers or break a paper into sub-papers. Like you can have one idea and then you can say, actually, I can turn this one idea into 2 sub-ideas and I get 2 papers out of it. This is something some people do. Some people don't think this is the right way of doing things. It is one concept, it should be one paper. So then it's the question, does it make more sense to wait and have one really good paper that takes 2 years? Or do you break it up and have 2 papers that take 1 year each? So this is a question we have to ask ourselves. And then it comes to the point where we enter this kind of publish or perish mentality that is associated with science and with academia, where if you're not publishing, if you're not putting out results, how do you then advertise yourself in the postdoc applications or in the grant applications? Now, there is gradually a push to not really focus on how many publications people have, but you still need publications on a topic. If I'm writing a grant proposal saying, I'm going to revolutionize the field of gravitational waves, but I only have 1 paper on gravitational waves, people are going to be like, why? And speaking from experience here, this is very much a real example. So at this point, there is the question of, do we focus on the science that we want to do? Or do we focus on these metrics of the publications, the amount of talks I've given, in order to guarantee the chances of the next job? This is not a question I have an answer to. It's a question that we all have to ask ourselves at some point. Now, of course, usually you work with other people and it's not just up to you. Everyone's doing their own battle. There have been a couple of my papers that have coincidentally come out a week or 2 weeks or the same day that a grant was due, because having that paper might affect my chances, or having that paper out public might affect the chances of getting a grant. And this is often the case. So there is usually a period where people will push to get papers out in order to coincide with application season. There's an excellent question here coming in from Alok. Is there any kind of bias in faculty selection at big universities? Yes. I would like to say no, but realistically, yes. Everyone is biased. We all have our own biases. We work to overcome them, but we all have our own biases. Usually there are systems in place to try to reduce these biases, to try to mitigate them. And that is something that people really try to do. But there is always going to be some type of bias. Now, I can say I have gone through one faculty application where I applied for a permanent position and I didn't get it. And the whole process was super transparent and really open. And I genuinely believe that they made the right decision. That I didn't make it to the final stage of the interviews, but I generally feel like the people who did make it absolutely deserve to be there. And I feel like just the whole openness of the process made it feel not biased to me. But it very much depends. There's also the thing at the postdoc level, when we're doing this whole postdoc application thing, that a lot of times people are going to hire people they already know. This is very obvious. If if you have 200 people applying for the same postdoc position, which is not an absurd number, this is pretty much the numbers that you can expect for one position. How do you make that call? Everyone's going to have some publications, everyone's going to have good letters of recommendations. How do you make that call? And oftentimes there will be a bias of like, okay, or not even a bias, but just kind of the human urge to work with people you know you can work well with. If you want to hire somebody for 3 years, you're going to hire somebody you know you can work with. So if it's somebody who, for an example, has worked with one of your colleagues or someone you know from a conference, someone you've interacted with before, there's a higher chance of hiring that person because there is this idea of, okay, if we already know each other, we're going to work well together. And this is not just in academia, this is the human idea of working with people you know. And this is why, one of the reasons why networking is so important in our field, because maybe that professor that you meet at the conference is going to be offering a postdoc in 3 years and might remember you from the conference. So while I don't think there are some biases in the whole hiring process, some things that are trying to be mitigated, but there is always this idea that people are going to hire people they know. I know someone who will only hire people if one of the people writing their letters of recommendation is a friend. So if you look at this person, it's like if I look at an application and I don't know any of the 3 people writing the letters of recommendation, I'm not going to read the application because I don't know this. I don't know why I should. If you're getting 200 applications for one position, you have to make these calls. It's terrible, but this is something that people do. So there is a bias where people are more likely to hire people that they know. Counterpoint to that, my postdoc in Helsinki, I'd never met the people before the interview. So it's not always the case that you only hire your friends. I got this position here. I love this job. I'm very happy about being in Helsinki. But I didn't know anybody here before the interview stage. So there is that as well. But keeping on the application thing, I realize I'm on point 3 of my list of 20. So this is either going to be a very long stream or I'm going to cut things because I am literally on point 3 of 20. And we are 40 minutes in. This is this is going to be a long stream. But buckle up, everyone. We're here for a long time. I should, my tea's going to be cold by now. Okay, just some more comments before I get into what I was about to say, sticking with the application process. Okay, comment from Emma. Your recent project took 3 years because your journal editor did not bother finding a referee. Yeah, there is also the whole peer review process that slows things down, but is also very useful. But I'm not going to go into peer review process today. I'm saving that for its own 1 hour long stream. Comment from Shawnee here. What is an example of a project you worked on? I would say check out my other streams for that. But briefly, I have 23 papers out. I have papers on dark matter. I have papers on the cosmic microwave background radiation. I have papers on gravitational waves. So there's examples of projects I've worked on is like trying to figure out how likely we are to measure specific things with future space missions. That's a cool project. Okay, another comment from Emma. Good thing about academia, sometimes your friends bring banana bread or cake to the office. Yeah, I do have a tendency to bring banana bread and cake to the office, which is a good thing. Sticking with the application thing. Now, for some reason, there is kind of an agreed upon time where most applications take place. And that is 1 year before your position ends. And it's usually in autumn. There are some positions advertised outside of this cycle, but the most common cycle in academia is that postdoc positions are advertised between now and December. Offers are made January, February, March, and then you start the next position in September, or September, October. And this is partly because oftentimes this is going to involve moving country, so you need a few months' notice to be able to get everything ready to move country. But it's also just kind of an established thing. The application season is in September, October, autumn time. And this has both good and bad things. It has the good thing that you know when all positions are going to be advertised, it's autumn. There are positions advertised throughout the year as well, but the bulk of them will be in autumn. So then you have the crunch. You have the autumn application season crunch, This is also why a lot of papers are finished in August or September, so that the people doing the applications have another paper to add. Usually, if you look throughout the year when papers come out, there's always a peak just before application season in autumn. But it also has the bad thing that if you want if you want to change position during that period, you are going to have fewer options. Like if at some point in March you just decide, like, I've had enough of this PhD, of this postdoc position, I want to do a different postdoc position, your chances of finding something are going to be a lot smaller. There will be options advertised, and in a sense there's going to be fewer people applying that time of the year. But it makes it very hard when most positions are advertised in autumn. So there's kind of this 1 year cycle, and every autumn is when applications go out, which is terrible because it also coincides for a lot of people with the new term starting, with teaching responsibility starting. Usually September, October, November is the worst for applications. Most of my applications have been in that period. That's also the period when a lot of grant applications are due. So then it's the crunch where you try to finish papers and you do the applications, knowing full well that there will be 200 people applying for each position, at least. You know, the figure of 200 is one that I know is an accurate figure, but it very much depends on the position. Okay, so applications are terrible. Postdocs are terrible, and the whole grant application process is terrible, especially because there is this underlying idea that most positions will involve moving country. And the more you set your own boundaries of I don't want to move country, the harder it's going to be to find that position. You know, in my case, I've gradually constrained my boundaries more and more. At some point, I was like, you know, I kind of don't want to leave Europe, so I am only going to apply in Europe. And then it was like, now I'm at the stage I'm like, I want to stay in Finland, and I'm setting this as a boundary. So finding positions in Finland has completely narrowed down the amount of positions that I would be able to apply for. And obviously, you know, there is no right or wrong age to do your PhD, to do your postdoc. There is absolutely no right age to do these things. But generally, if people do everything without a break, you tend to be in your postdoc stage when entering your late 20s, early 30s, which is also the time where a lot of us would like to start families. And then there's a question of how do you do this? How do you start a life, a family, a future, or even like you want to buy an apartment, you want to start saving for a pension fund? How do you do this when every 2 or 3 years you have to move country? You know, some people manage to stay in the same country. It is rare, but some people manage to do this. In my case, I'm on country number 6. And don't get me wrong, I've loved it. I've loved being able to live in 6 countries. But it means that every couple of years, I've had to kind of reset my whole social life, make new friends, make a whole new kind of world for myself, make a life for myself, or find a place where I can do my hobbies, learn a new language, integrate into a new culture, make new friends for 2 or 3 years. And then you move on. And it is a cycle that does end up being very, very draining. But on the topic of going to different countries, I want to talk about one good thing about academia. One of the good things, because I just focus on a big negative. One of the good things is that we get to travel a lot. I love traveling. So there are these international conferences. Usually people will go to 2 or 3 conferences a year. And this is where you get like 100, 200, 300 people who work on similar topics, and you throw them together in a place. And it's really where a lot of brainstorming happens, a lot of knowledge exchange happens. You learn what other people are working on. You get to tell people what you're working on. But also a lot of networking. You get to meet new people. You get to figure out what other people are working on in general, what's kind of happening in the field. Because it's very easy sometimes to focus on your own topic. And conferences are a chance to take a step back and say, like, okay, what's happening in general? Especially, I try to go to like one general conference a year and one specialized conference plus whatever else comes up. So a general one might be like I go to a dark matter conference where it's everybody working on dark matter, and I hear about what the experimentalists are doing, what the particle people are doing, what the cosmologists are doing, what astrophysicists are doing. And other times I'll go to a conference on like understanding the background of gravitational waves with Lisa. And then it's 50 of us working on the same topic in a room together trying to figure things out. I've had projects that came about because of discussions at conferences. And I've got some really, really good friends that I met at conferences or at these international workshops. And being able to go to these as part of my job is really cool. And it's something that I love about academia. And it's something that we noticed a lot during lockdown. Of course, everyone was extremely affected by the lockdown. One thing that for us was very noticeable in how it changed our job, my work can be done from home. I don't need to go to the office. I go to the office to chat to people. More on that later. But I can do my job from home. The biggest difference during the lockdown was that this whole conferencing was cut off. A lot of people tried to do online conferences, which really worked in some regards and didn't in others. But being able to go to conferences in person is really cool. But I want to make 2 comments about this. The first is conferences are in general inaccessible. This is something that I'm noticing more and more now, and this was, in hindsight, something I should have been even more aware of before. I am chronically ill. Sometimes traveling is something that I cannot do. I love traveling. Sometimes I can't do it. And there are a lot of people who, for whatever reason, cannot necessarily travel to these conferences. And given that we kind of established that these conferences are an extremely important networking opportunity, they need to be accessible to everyone in academia. And oftentimes they're not. People who have caring responsibilities, people who have medical conditions, people who do not have financial support often cannot go to these conferences. So while the whole conference system is great in some regards, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to make it something that everyone has equal access to. It's also like for time after lockdown, a lot of conferences were hybrid. You could go in person, you could follow online, and that was the perfect solution. And somehow this year, I feel like every conference has just gone back to in person. You must travel for it. You must have a carbon footprint and come in person. I've had several battles with different conference organizers this year trying to get people to make things hybrid with very little success. So while conferences are amazing, they should be something that everyone can participate in. And on this note, there is a big problem with going to conferences as an academic, which is that these are work expenses. They are covered by work in most cases, but they're not paid up front. So usually to go to these conferences, I will have to pay for the conference myself, the accommodation, depending on the university, the flights, you pay for them yourselves as well, the conference fee, the food. And then when you get back, you do a reimbursement claim and fight the university to give you back the money. Depending on the university, this can be as simple as filling out a form, or it can be, here's 10 different forms and I want receipts of literally every single thing you spent. And this is ridiculous because these conferences are not cheap. Usually we're talking about anywhere between 750 euros to 1,200 euros. And especially for students, this is a lot of money for the university to owe you for anywhere between 1 and 6 months. During my PhD, I did a tour of the US where I went to the US for a month. I visited 9 different universities. I gave 8 talks in the span of 3 weeks, visited a bunch of cities. It was absolute chaos, but also brilliant fun. And it was in autumn, so I was giving talks during the day, postdoc applications at night. 2018 was a crazy year for me. But that whole trip came to about 2,200 euros. Because it involved so many cities, it was complicated. It took the university 6 months to reimburse me. That is a lot of money. So while we can go to these conferences, this whole reimbursement culture is extremely exclusive because it's assuming that people have their own money where they can pay for this, or it's assuming that people have savings they can and are willing to dip into for a work expense. And I know in a lot of non-academia jobs, if you're sent on a business trip, it's paid for. You might have some expenses that you claim back on the ground, but the flights, the accommodation, the conference fees are paid for in advance. Whereas in our case, we have to front the money and then wait for it to be paid back. And it's not paid back until after the conference. So, I'm currently in a situation where this is not a problem, but just to give the example, I've just registered for a course. This is a course that is relevant to my work experience. This is something that I think will enhance my work. It's a course that takes place in November. I will get reimbursed for this, probably in December. I paid it this week. And then I'm currently in a situation where I can do this, but not everybody is. So this leads to the question of, who are we building academia for? Or who is academia intended for? Because if conferences which are necessary for networking are not accessible, if we're assuming that people have money to be able to put their own money into these work events and then get refunded, who is academia targeting? And before I answer that, some comments here. There's a question about the CMB. Don't worry, Beth. Don't worry. The CMB will appear at some point. I have a plan. Comment from Arlo. What do you do when your master's thesis supervisor declines or doesn't show interest on giving you an LOR? Yeah, I'm going to come back to that. That is an excellent question about the relationship between the students and the supervisors. I'm going to come back to that. Yeah, fees should be covered by the university. Sometimes they're not. Yes, they should reimburse with interest. Yes, if I have to dip into my savings to pay for a conference, which I have done in the past, why does that not come back with interest? Yes. Why do I need to wait 6 months to get the money back for what is essentially a work expense? Then there's random rules, like some make sense, some don't. Like if you take a taxi, depending on the university where you work, you have to justify it. Like for one of my conferences in Germany, I took one taxi and they sent back my claim, like, why didn't you take a bus? So then I had to prove that there was a bus strike that day and taxi was the only way for me to get around. It's just for a €5 taxi. And they rejected my whole claim and I had to go back and forth because I didn't justify why I took a taxi one day. Yes, reimbursement culture is not good. So the question of who is academia set up for? And there is very much the problem that oftentimes the whole academic structure is built under the assumption that you are somebody who is probably or someone who has a certain amount of generational wealth or your own wealth, somebody who is able-bodied, able to travel to all of these conferences. So academia, in essence, was set up at the time where the only people in academia were cishet white men with a stay-at-home wife. And in a lot of aspects, with a parent in academia, this is kind of like the stereotypical academic of the times when academia was became a thing, when these universities became a thing. And in a lot of aspects, it feels often that this is still the target group of academia. That if you deviate from the norm in any way, it becomes harder to be in academia. And this is especially true the more you deviate from the norm, in quotation marks, because it is not the norm, it is just what it is set up for. The more you deviate from the standard man with stay-at-home wife, the harder it is to exist in academia, because academia is not built for people who deviate from the norm, the expectation. A comment from Scott, at least you have savings. Yeah, so just a comment on this, I didn't have savings until very recently because moving country is expensive and moving country every few years is quite expensive. But in general, academics in a lot of countries will make above the average wage. So in that regard, we are very lucky. We are very privileged. This is not true in all countries. There are some countries where PhD students are on minimum wage. There are some countries where PhD students are not paid. That is unpaid work. But you do it for the glory. You do it for nonsense. If you're not paid to do it and it is a job, why are you doing it? Why should unpaid work should not be a thing? Anyway, yes, in general, we do make more than the average, and that is a privilege that we do have. On the other hand, the amount of training and expertise that we have is not always correlated with our salary. I know that with my skill set, I could get a job in the private sector making double what I make in academia. Now, again, I am in a very privileged position that my salary is enough to cover all of my needs. And I'm happy about this. And I do have savings. And this, again, is a privilege that I do have now. It's one that I've not always had, but it's one that I do have now. So this is very much, I am aware that people in academia do, on average, make more money than the minimum wage or the average wage of a country. That is absolutely a true thing to say. But I want to come back and talk about the people in academia. So I was just saying that, academia is set up assuming you fit a very specific type, and the more you deviate from this, the harder it is to be in academia. If you're neurodivergent, if you have mental health issues, if you have any disability, if you don't have a parent in academia, if you don't have rich parents, all of this makes it harder. Obviously, if you're a person of color, if all of this makes it a lot harder to exist in academia. And this leads to a culture where it often feels like minorities are not necessarily welcome in academia, which is not always the case. And now I want to talk about the people. And I think one of the nicest things about academia, one of the best things, is the people you get to work with. Like, I have met some truly incredible people in academia, people who are trying to make academia better, people who have carved out a life and existence for themselves within the boundaries of academia, people who have set their own boundaries and made academia fit them. I have met some absolutely incredible people, and my favorite thing about science is chatting to other people about the science I get to do. Science is not something we do in isolation. It's not something we do alone. Science is a group project. It is something we work on together. Going to these conferences, chatting to people, working with collaborators, just discussing with these people who are trying to figure out things, even topics that I don't work on, is amazing. Getting to interact with these amazing people is one of the greatest things in academia. Also, as Emma just said before, some people bring cakes to the office. Often that someone is me, but not always. And there's kind of this shared experience of being in academia together. Despite moving country every few years, the friends I've made in academia, the office colleagues, the PhD students, the people in the office who kind of have this shared experience of being in academia, those friendships are amazing. And I generally think that meeting these people is one of the highlights of academia. But of course, there are amazing people in every walk of life. And I think in every job, you get to meet amazing people and you get to meet terrible people. Academia is no different. But going through academia with other people is what makes academia fun. Otherwise, there is this kind of stereotype of the lone genius scientist. That is nonsense. That's not how science works. Science is a collaborative process. Science relies on talking to people. And that is something that I generally think is amazing. I love having group meetings, having journal clubs, having things where I get to interact with my colleagues, having coffee breaks where we just chill. But that in itself is truly an amazing experience. And some days when I'm not feeling motivated about academia, I'll talk to people like, hey, what are you working on? And sometimes they tell me random, one of my friends from my undergrad at some point was working on using neutrons to try to see if there were any flies inside cheese. And I was just like, that is so amazing. That is so cool. We studied the same undergrad and we're working on vastly different topics. It's just like that is so cool. Incidentally, they're now using the same technology to try to understand statues from the Bronze Age. Just mind-blowing. The things people work on is truly amazing. The people doing these weird things, these amazing things, that is amazing. That is a great thing about science, about academia. Coming from Five, it's absurd that there are so many good things about academia, but so many bad things. Yes, and I'm halfway through my list now. But sticking with the people. Again, I have people that I work with currently, that I've worked with in the past, who are genuinely incredible people. People who are trying to make a difference in academia, people who are trying to make things better, who are just trying to live their lives the best they can within the boundaries of academia and making academia fit them. And that is inspirational and that is amazing. But there's also a negative side to this. There are, as in every field, there are some people in academia who are absolute assholes. And that is true everywhere, but there are several things in academia that kind of make this whole thing worse. And one of them, it comes back to this idea that it is a highly competitive field. Every postdoc application, there's going to be a couple hundred applying for one place. every grant application, there's going to be a couple thousand people applying, knowing that there's only a 10% success rate. This also means that your colleagues are your competitors. And this is a mindset that I very much do not like. There's a lot of people that I did my PhD with, or who I've collaborated with, who we have applied at the same time for the same positions. And I think there are two ways to approach this. The way I try to do it is like, we are in this together. Here's my application material, send me yours. Let's compare, let's share notes. Let's go in this together. Hey, I did the interview first. Here's what they asked me to give you a heads up. The idea that we are in this together, we need to succeed. But at the same time, every position that one of my colleagues gets, if we're applying at the same time, is a position I'm not going to get. So I very much believe that we succeed in this together. We do not do this alone. We all succeed in this or we all fail in this. But unfortunately, the reality of it is that we are going to be applying at the same time as our colleagues and as their friends. And that is something that is not a nice situation to be in. Then there's the sticking with the competitiveness, the competitive nature of academia. There's also the risk when you go to a conference that I have been warned sometimes going to a conference, like, talk about your results, but not in enough detail that somebody could reproduce them. Because there are people who will listen to a presentation, take notes, and put out a paper on your topic before you. There has also been some situations that I've heard of on someone that I know personally who did a bachelor thesis or a master thesis, and then the supervisor was like, these are cool results. I'm going to publish them without you. So there is kind of this whole idea that people in academia will often steal each other's ideas. Occasionally this does happen. One of the first conferences I went to, I was warned, there are these 3 people here, be careful what you tell them about your project, because they know how to do it as well. And I was like, surely if they know how to do it, I can talk to them and get ideas. No, I was warned specifically, like, these 3 people at this conference, be careful what you say to them. And I don't want to go to a conference having to be aware of, is this person generally interested in my work, or are they trying to figure out if they can do it better? So that is one issue, that people often tend to be very competitive. Personally, I try not to be. I hope that we all do well. I hope that academia can accommodate us all. And I really want to tell you about my work, and I want to hear about your work. And if you're applying, I'll send you my material. I don't care. There was actually a time where me and one of my very close friends applied to exactly the same positions. Like, the last postdoc round, I think, of all of the ones we applied to, we had like 90% overlap. And for all of them, we were like, okay, I've already finished. Here's what I sent. So then we were kind of tailoring it so we weren't saying exactly the same thing, but we had very similar profiles. We were applying for the same job. And we went into this together. And I really feel like not only did it improve our friendship, but also we helped each other out. He reviewed my material, I reviewed his. We both got really good positions at the end of it. But that is something that not everyone will do. And that is sometimes very frustrating. Another thing I want to mention in academia, and I'm not going to dwell on this because I just don't want to dwell on this, there is a lot of harassment and bullying and, unfortunately, sexual assault in academia. There was a study done in Sweden a few years ago where they found that 1 in 15 people in academia, either students or staff, 1 in 15 had experienced some form of bullying, work-related, within the last year. This is an unacceptable number. I'm not going to go into the cases of sexual assault that are known and the ones that are not known, because it's not something I want to talk about, but it is something that we have to talk about when we're talking about the negatives of academia. There is very much this whole culture that lends into this toxicity sometimes. And this leads me to the thing I do want to talk about, which a few of you have already kind of implied in the comments here, which is the power structures. Now, academia, unfortunately, does have many hierarchies. Some places will choose to ignore them, some places won't. But academia does inherently come with hierarchies. A student works with a supervisor. The supervisor usually has a boss. There's this whole chain, this whole hierarchy. And especially at the level of the PhD supervisor and the master supervisor, this is a dynamic where one person has a huge amount of power over the other person's career. Because if you're a PhD student, you need your supervisor to send you to conferences, to introduce you to people, to allow you to network, to allow you to get out there and to be known. And this is something that a supervisor should facilitate. At the very minimum, the supervisor should let it happen. I know supervisors who have prevented this from happening. And if you're in a situation where your career depends on that one person doing what's expected of them, that's a very big power differential. And that can very much lead to situations where harassment and bullying and sexual assault becomes easier because of the big power dynamic. And this is something, I know a lot of people who have quit academia because of a bad supervisor, because of a bad supervisor at the master's or at the bachelor's or at the PhD level, especially at the PhD level. Some places will try to mitigate this. A lot of universities have rules that you need to have 2 supervisors, which distributes the power a bit. I think one of my preferred dynamics is if you have a PhD student, a postdoc, and a professor, because then there's different levels of power imbalance and it kind of mitigates everything a bit. It kind of slows things down. It kind of reduces the overall differential of power, the overall difference and the situations. Some places will also have things like a thesis committee. This is something Finland has, where there's 2 or 3 professors who are kind of in charge of reviewing. Once a year, you meet with your thesis committee as a PhD student to discuss how your PhD is going and how things are progressing. Fortunately, it is usually on the PhD student to arrange these meetings, to set these up. But if we go back to the situation where there are not many jobs in academia and there's only a specific time of the year where you can apply, if you are in a situation that feels like a toxic work environment, it is very hard to leave, because there's often this idea that if you quit your PhD, it's very hard to jump into another one, because you kind of need an explanation for why you quit your PhD or why you stopped your PhD. That means that if you're in a situation where there is this power imbalance, where there is something bad happening, apart from the fact that there is a risk to your career if you get out, even if you're out, even at the postdoc level, if you want to quit in between this 1-year cycle, it becomes very, very difficult. And this makes it a lot easier for situations of bullying and harassment to happen. So it very much gets into a situation where your whole career can be dependent on 1 or 2 people. And if those people don't want to send you to conferences, don't introduce you to people, aren't proactive in your research, or if one of your supervisors suddenly decides they've lost interest in your project and never want to work on it again, these are all cases that I've either experienced or know of people who have experienced, then it becomes very, very difficult. And because of the inherent power dynamic, which again, this exists in a lot of places, but academia is kind of inherently built on these power dynamics where one person can have a complete say, not only over your current job, but over your chances of getting a job in the future. There's also the thing, every postdoc application I've done, I've had a letter of recommendation from my PhD advisor. Usually, if you don't have a letter of recommendation from your PhD advisor, there's a question of why not? This person worked with you for 3 or 4 years. Why is there not a letter of recommendation? And there's not really room in the applications that you send off to add a footnote of, by the way, there were issues and this is why there's not this letter of recommendation. It's something that immediately stands out. So if there is this problem with the supervisor, it can affect not only your current job, but your whole career prospects. Now, Emma here in the comments, fellow PhD student, well, not that I'm a PhD student anymore, PhD student here in the group, Emma, is saying that, if your supervisor doesn't introduce you to people, if they're not social, this is something that the student really notices. So there really is this power differential that makes it very difficult, especially as a PhD student, to get out of a potentially difficult situation. As Emma was just pointing out here, I mentioned that a dynamic that I like is PhD student, postdoc, professor. postdocs might not be around for the full duration of the PhD. You know, they might have to leave after 2 or 3 years because the postdoc ends, and that leaves a vacuum. That leaves one supervisor suddenly disappeared, which is also not great. And I know far too many people who have had to quit because of a bad supervisor. Now, I just want to pause here and make a comment that currently I am in a very good situation. I'm in a group that I generally really like, working with people who I really get on well with, and where I feel like there is a good environment. And if these things were not true, I would not be doing this stream. You know, I'm in a place where I feel like I can come and do the stream. I've had these conversations with my colleagues, with my boss, with my supervisor. You know, these are conversations that I've been able to have. So while I'm talking about these issues that exist and ones that I have experienced in the past, I just want to make it very, very clear here that I'm not talking about my experience right now. Because right now I'm in a very nice group. I'm in a situation that I'm very happy with. And I'm in a place where I actually generally feel respected and accepted, and this is amazing. So just really want to make it clear here that I'm not in any way talking about my current situation, talking about the situation of a lot of people that I know and a lot of people, my own experiences in the past, but it is not my current situation. So this leads me to the next point. I see some comments here on, yeah, even outside of academia, there are often times where there's somebody with position of power or authority over other people who has a job that they shouldn't have. And my general idea is that if you don't know how to be around people, you should not be supervising people. If you are not a good person, you should not be supervising people. But this is very difficult to implement. So now I want to take all of this together and talk about one of the biggest things in academia that I feel is not discussed enough, which is mental health. So we're in a situation where we don't have long-term job stability. We're in a highly competitive field where we constantly have to feel this push to be productive, to put out papers, to publish, to do all of these things we're supposed to do, to go to these conferences, while having no long-term stability, while being in a situation that might involve a toxic work environment. And this leads to a high incidence of mental health problems in academia. Now, a recent survey that was done a couple of years ago, I believe, found that almost 43% of academics reported having either stress, burnout, anxiety, or depression. Trigger warning for suicide here. Apparently, 1 in 5 academics has actively considered suicide within the last year. There are articles with these numbers. I'll put some links down below in the YouTube section afterwards. I'll put some links, references to these numbers. These numbers are completely unacceptable. Now, of course, I'm not in any way saying that mental health is only happens in academia. That is absolutely not the thing. There are mental health problems. There are mental health crises in a lot of fields. I believe medicine also, doctors also have a very high incidence of it. And in academia, it is the situation I can talk of. Now, personally, I experienced the burnout during my PhD, and I did not have the resources to deal with it. Hey, Paul, great to see you. Came in for the end. Don't worry, we've still got at least 15 minutes to go. It's a long stream today. Great to see you here. Yeah, so during my PhD, I did have a burnout. I did not necessarily have the resources to deal with it. This year, I almost had another burnout, and I noticed how bad I was getting back in spring, and I basically checked myself into therapy like, hi, I think I'm burnt out. And now I'm in a situation where I do have the resources to deal with it. And because I was able to catch it early, because of the situation I'm in currently, because of the advantages that I have right now, I was able to deal with it when it happened. And it was not as big an issue as it was when it happened to me 6 years ago. I would say most of my friends in academia struggle with anxiety. There's a whole imposter syndrome, which I haven't mentioned, which is there as well, because there's a highly competitive field. So there is constantly the thought of, why did they hire me when they had 200 other people they could have hired? Oh God, I tricked them. I shouldn't be here. Daily thoughts that happen to everybody, and I've realized they happen to everybody at every stage. I was talking to a professor recently who was like, oh, I don't know if I can answer your physics question. I'm not a good physicist. I was like, you're a professor at the university, you're a good physicist. You can answer my question. So imposter syndrome runs across the board. The amount of people in academia who struggle with their mental health is ridiculously high. It's unreasonably high. And there was a question of why is this allowed to be the case? Why is there this situation? Universities might send you a well-being seminar. They might send you once a month a thing of like, go do a meditation thing. I went to one of these like university well-being events last year. That was basically a 1 hour lecture of, this is how bad stress is for your body. And we were like, thanks. I know that. Can you tell me how to deal with it? No, there was nothing how to deal with it. It was just like, this is why you shouldn't be stressed. It is bad for you. Being stressed is going to kill you. And we were like, this is not helping. And this leads me to another point here. That I think one of the biggest misconceptions about academia, about universities, is that universities care about you. That academia cares about individual people. It's a saying that something I like to say frequently. You might love academia, it will never love you back. As far as a university is concerned, as far as academia is concerned, as far as science is concerned, every one of us is replaceable. If you can't perform your job, someone else will. There's 200 other applicants who can do it. So if you don't have a good supervisor to vouch for you, if you don't have a good network because your supervisor hasn't helped you set it up, and you struggle with your mental health, you are basically on your own. The university does not care. Academia does not care. And this is something that I think, we often like to think, oh, we're all this one big happy family, we're in this together. We are all replaceable pieces of a big machine, as is everybody under capitalism. Had to make that comment, you all know I had to. But in academia, it's really very much, if you're lucky and you have a good supervisor, your chances of doing well are much higher. If you have a bad supervisor, your chances of leaving academia are much higher. Nobody should have this much power over somebody's career. And academia, this like mythical concept, does not care about individual people. And I think this is one of the biggest reality checks that a lot of people go through, is realizing that we have to care for ourselves, we have to care for our colleagues, we have to care for people around us, because nobody else will. And if you have a supervisor, when I had what was almost a burnout in March, the day after I spoke to my therapist, I went to my supervisor like, hey, I think I'm burnt out. And we made a plan. But this is something that I couldn't do 6 years ago. I have also had many professors tell me directly, if you struggle with your mental health, you're not fit to be in academia. So I feel like academics tend to go two ways. The ones who make it, the ones who have permanent positions or are well established in academia, even at postdoc level, I feel like there's two mentalities. There's a mentality of, well, I survived and it wasn't that difficult, so there's no real problems, which is unfortunately very common. And then there's the mentality of, I went through hell to be here and I don't want anyone else to go through this. Let's try to fix things. Over the last few years, fortunately, I've met many more of the latter, of people who are really like, no, this is wrong. Let's try to fix it. But the whole mental health situation in academia is just really, really not good. Yeah, the comment, people here in the comments saying like, relax, snap out of it, is a standard advice. It is, yeah. It's like, oh, you're stressed. Have you tried being less stressed? Also, tends to be what doctors tell you. You're stressed. Have you tried not being stressed? You're ill. Have you tried drinking water? Standard advice. Works around the board, apparently. Yes. So then there's this whole mental health problem in academia is something that is a big problem. So I've talked about a lot of negatives, the lack of job security, the potentially toxic environments, the reimbursement culture that sets it up for specific people. And then there's a prevalent idea in academia that if you're not working hard enough, you're just not passionate. Because I mentioned at the beginning, we go into academia because we want to be part of this knowledge, we want to gain knowledge. And there is the idea of like, well, why aren't you making this your entire existence? I know a lot of people who will work 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, who will talk about physics over lunch, over every coffee break. And they will eventually burn out because nobody can do that long term. But then there is this idea of, are you not passionate enough? Where's your passion? Where's your dedication? Where's your overwork? Where's your commitment? And this leads to this idea that we have to do more, we have to deliver more, which feeds very well into people's imposter syndrome. And it's not good. I know people who will literally only talk about physics and be like, well, if you're not willing to put in the 12 hours a day, somebody else will. Which is not good. And then there's the final thing to all of this. Because a lot of academics are passionate, we all go in for our reasons. We go in because we want to be part of this. Why would you leave? Why would you ever leave? Despite all of these problems, there is the prevalent idea that if you leave academia, you failed. And this is the thing that a lot of academics will sell to you. If you switch to industry, it's because you couldn't cut it as a scientist. It's because you failed. It's because you weren't good enough. It's because you dropped out. It is rarely seen as a viable career path. A lot of career events for bachelor students, for master students, are geared towards there is one path, which is master's, PhD, postdoc, professor. That is your path. And if you deviate from this, you have failed as a scientist. This is something that I've had people tell me directly. This is kind of the culture that is surrounding us. And I know a lot of people who have stayed in a toxic environment for far too long in academia because otherwise you have failed. This is something that some people are trying to disentangle. We're trying to move away from this. There are now university events targeted towards people trying to leave. I was very happy to attend one recently that was set up by former postdocs for postdocs. That was like how to leave academia as a postdoc. And it was a really positive vibe, kind of like, if you want to leave, great, it's the next stage of your career, your next stage of your life. Let's do it. And I feel like a lot of academics are still stuck with this idea of if you leave, it's because you failed. And that is absolutely not true. There are hundreds of very good reasons why somebody might leave. I listed some of them today, but in general, there are many good reasons why somebody might want to leave academia. And this idea of if you leave, you have failed is extremely damaging. And I think one big thing that we should change is how we talk about non-academic careers. And really, I've mentioned that some of the good things about academia are traveling, getting to chat to cool people, getting to work on cool things. These things happen inside and outside academia. They are not specific to academia. In the same way that a lot of the negatives that I've talked about are not specific to academia. So I think there needs to be a greater idea of embracing the fact that we are highly trained people who can do a lot of jobs, and it is not a failure to want to do something that might offer more job security or might be a better environment or might pay you better or might just be a better fit for whatever reason. It is not a negative thing. I do realize there was one positive thing about academia that I didn't mention that I wanted to, which is the flexibility that we have. I work flexible time, which means if I wake up one day, I'm going to be like, I'll work from home today. I usually can. As long as I stick to the meetings that I have. Again, this is not specific to academia. There are other jobs that offer this, but it's something that I personally enjoy. It's also like some days I wake up and I have a slow morning. I'm like, I'll just work in the evening. That's fine. I'll just shift my work time. I'll just work more next week. And I can do this. And this flexibility is really good, especially as I've mentioned before, I am chronically ill. Some days I wake up and my chronic illness hits me. I'm like, I just physically cannot work today. And then being able to just say like, fine, I'll just shift my work hours to another day. I'll just take the day off. I'll just go in late. The fact that I can do that is something that I do not take for granted because I know that is a privilege. And it's something that I very much appreciate. And then there's also the intellectual freedom. So I mentioned earlier on, like starting this, that we go into academia to answer questions, to work on some cool stuff. And then I said that sometimes you work on what other people tell you to work on instead of what you want to work on. But there is still a lot of intellectual freedom in academia, not only in the topics we work on, but in how we approach them. I might have 5 or 6 specific tasks related to a project. One of them might be running new simulations. One of them might be coding something. I might have to read some new papers. And on any given day, unless there's an approaching deadline or a meeting that we've all agreed on tasks we're going to do, on any given day, I can wake up and decide what I want to do today. Like, some days I wake up and think, I'm really in the mood for coding today, and I have a coding task that I can jump into. Some days I'll wake up like, I'm going to run simulations because it's something that lets my mind focus on other things, just going to run simulations all day. And this kind of intellectual freedom of what questions you work on and how you spend your time, I think is something that academics sometimes take for granted, because I know in a lot of non-academia jobs, it's like, these are your tasks that you have to do today. There's a whole system that relies on you getting these tasks done today. And in academia, obviously, we have our deadlines, we have our grant deadlines, we have the publication deadlines coinciding with application season. And if someone needs something, a student needs something, that becomes priority. But there is this freedom of kind of choosing how I spend my time. Even if you're in a situation where your supervisor tells you what to work on, there is still freedom in the day-to-day work. And I think that is something that is really, really cool. The counterpoint of this flexible work time, nobody keeps track of my hours. I do this myself. Nobody else keeps track of my hours. So if one day I choose to work 12 hours, nobody's going to stop me. If I choose to work 12 hours 5 days in a row, I have to stop myself from doing this, which I didn't do during my PhD because of the environment I was in. But and I feel like flexible time, free to work whenever you want, often means that people tend to overwork rather than underwork. As is also the case, like, nobody keeps track of my holiday days. I know how many I'm allowed to take, and I make sure I take them. But a lot of the people I work with, I ask them sometimes, like, how many holiday days have you taken this year? And it is often under the amount we're supposed to take, because nobody's keeping track. Nobody tells you, hey, you have 10 holiday days you need to use up this month. And it's very easy to lean into this idea that, yeah, it's, see, this is why we don't go for an hour and a half normally, because my voice breaks by an hour and 20 minutes. So this leads into the idea of, well, if I don't put in 12 hours of work a day, somebody else might. And maybe that somebody else will then get more positions, which is an idea that has taken me many years to separate. Like, if someone else wants to work 12 hours a day, that's on them. I'm going to work what I'm paid to work, and I'm going to go home and rest and chill and do what I want to do. But this is something that has taken me many years to reach this balance of being able to do things and working, having this work-life balance. Sometimes I mess up the balance, but right now I'm in a stage where I keep track of my work hours and I have good work-life balance. But this is as a consequence of my first burnout. And it's something that is very difficult to do. And not everyone can do it, especially when there's this expectation of you have to work this many hours. So I see there's been some people in the comments sharing their experience with bad supervisors in academia and outside of academia. It is great that you're all sharing your experiences. I know that working with a bad supervisor is a universal experience, not just in academia. The problem in academia is that this can dictate your whole career, unfortunately. There's a comment from Emma here, can't come to work today, there's a cat sleeping on me. Yeah, I feel like that should be a valid reason in any work. Like, here's a picture of my cat. Sorry, can't come off. Can't come to work. Can't move the cat. Comment from Paul. In my experience in industry, many people don't view scientists as field academics. It's almost the opposite, that they're the experts helping to guide the work. I agree. I agree that in industry, having a PhD, having a scientific background is often highly valued. And this is why, in general, if you have a degree, a university degree or a degree in science, it becomes a bit easier to get higher paid jobs outside of academia, in the non-academic world. But within academia, there is this idea of you left, you failed, which also means if you leave academia, it is often hard to go back, because a lot of people on the hiring side see that you left and they're like, why did you leave? I do know two people who left academia for a while and then came back. But it is very hard to do, because there is this idea of you left. Why did you leave? Why would anyone leave this place? And that really does not help the whole mentality that if you leave a toxic environment, you might never be able to get a job in academia again. And academics telling you have failed. I know one PhD advisor, who I'm not going to name, and I'm not talking about my own PhD advisor here, this is somebody else, who, when one of his PhD students chose to leave academia, this supervisor started bad-mouthing the student, like, he's leaving, he's failed. And I was there like, I don't think it's the student that's at fault here. I know exactly what happened there. Yes. Leaving academia is not in any way a failure. It is a very valid choice, and there are hundreds of good reasons to do it. Some I've mentioned today, and it might just be that you just want a change. Maybe you've had enough. So this has been 90 minutes of ups and downs of academia, and I am aware that I've talked a lot more about the negatives than about the positives. That is something that I am very aware of. And it's not because I think academia is only negatives. There are good things. I've been in academia for 15 years. I'm still in academia, and I'm still enjoying it. It has ups and downs, and we have to weigh for ourselves if it's worth doing. So just to wrap things up, some of the good things in academia, some of the good things is we get to work with really, really cool people on really cool things. We have a lot of intellectual freedom. I've been able to work on some amazing topics. I've worked on studying dark matter. I've worked on gravitational waves. I've worked on trying to figure out what the oldest light of the universe is. This map here, this cosmic microwave background radiation, in case you thought I'd forgotten. These are some of the amazing things I've been able to work on. My 15 years in academia have had a lot of ups. And I generally feel like the best thing for me is working on amazing topics, chatting with amazing people about the work I get to do. But there's also a lot of negatives. We have a complete lack of long-term stability. There are too many people and not enough positions, or there's not enough positions. There's this kind of expectation that we're going to move country. There's frequently power imbalances, which can sometimes exacerbate toxic work cultures. There's harassment, there's mental health crises in academia. There are really a lot of negatives, and there is this prevailing opinion that if you leave, you fail, which is nonsense. So then there's the question of why do we do it? Is it worth it? Is academia honestly worth it, given all of the negatives that I've mentioned today? This is a question that I can't answer for anybody else. I can only answer it for myself. And it is a question that I ask myself frequently. It's a question that I ask myself pretty much every time I go through an application season, every time I'm writing a grant proposal. It's the question of, is it worth it? Some days my answer is no. Generally, some days I'm like, this is not worth it anymore. And some days my answer is yes. And why do we still do it? I've been in academia for 15 years. I just got a new 1-year contract extension, and I'm extremely happy that I get to stay here for another year. So the question is why? With all the negatives, why? And for me, it comes down to the fact that I get to work on amazing things, and I get to talk to people about amazing things. I think if you've all watched any of my videos, you know that I love science. I genuinely love science, and I love being a scientist. If you watch my videos, like the first day we found gravitational waves, my video recently on the new Euclid results, that is what I like doing, being at a point where I can see these new cosmology results, where I can understand them, where I can explain them to people. That is amazing. And I generally feel like, for me, my love for science makes all of the rest of it worth it, because I really get to work on something I've loved working on for years, and I get to talk about things that I love talking about. For me right now, it is still worth it. And someday that answer might change. And this is a question that every academic needs to ask themselves, is it worth it? And someday the answer might be no, and that's okay. And if the answer becomes no every day, walk away from it, because there's no point staying if you don't want to do it. I think the biggest concern I have with academia is that I have seen many, many scientists lose their passion for science because of academia. And that is my concern, that if it reaches the point that all the negatives of academia outweigh it, it might reach the point where I can't deal with science anymore because of academia. And something I told myself years ago is that if I ever reach that point where I lose my interest in science because of academia, that's the point where I walk away. And I haven't reached that point yet, so I'm still here. But I completely get all of the many reasons why some people walk away from academia. And yeah, when I made notes today because I wanted to have a narrative. So I actually made notes today to guide this through in a kind of structured manner. And while I was making the notes, I was staring at them like, this is a lot of negatives. And then, I reached the point at the end where I was like, this is where you flash the CMB. I was like, yeah, I'm good. It's fine. I got the chance to flash the 90 minutes in, which is a new record for how long it took me to show the CMB, but you still got it. Okay, comment from Perth here. What's your utopian version of academia? It's got to be more than just everything he talked about minus the bad points. I genuinely don't know. And see, this is a problem that I've talked about a lot of the negatives, but I haven't offered solutions to fix them. I don't have the optimum solution. I think there are some obvious steps, like trying to address the mental health crisis, trying to reduce toxic work environments, which can be achieved partly by reducing the power dynamics in different situations. These are tangible goals that we can work towards. I think kind of reframing the whole approach we have to we must publish is going to take much longer, but is something that I do believe is underway and I do believe it is viable. As for the fact that there are not enough permanent positions or just not enough positions in general, I honestly don't have a solution to this. And I don't think anyone has a good solution to this. So while I complained a lot, I'm not offering tangible solutions. I think in an ideal situation, anyone who loves science should be given money to work on the topic they want to work on. But unfortunately, that's just not the reality that we live in. So I don't know how I would build the best academic structure, but I know a lot of things I would change. And there are tangible changes we can make. And I think one of them would be mental health. Focusing on improving mental health in academia, I think, would be a big thing. Improving accessibility in academia is another big thing that should be addressed. And in general, making sure that the people who do like academia and who do like it actually feel like they can stay. And I think that is a big thing that we can work on. So my conclusions. Like every job, academia has good things and bad things. There are a lot of bad things. For me personally, the good things outweigh it. Cup of Cosmology is not going anywhere. Don't worry, this is not me unofficially saying I'm leaving academia. Not yet. That might happen someday. Generally, it might happen someday. And that's fine. That's okay. But it is not this day. Not for me, but for many other people. So yeah, academia has ups and downs. There's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad. For me, the good things still outweigh the bad things, but that's not necessarily going to be the case 2 years from now. Who knows? Who knows what the future will bring? But some things we do know. And what we do know is that Cup of Cosmology is going to be on a 2-week break. This is completely unrelated, but I need to announce it anyway. So I am finally taking my summer vacation, which has been postponed. I am traveling this Friday, and I am super excited. I am generally looking forward to having 2 weeks where I don't do barely any work. There is like one day that I have to work, but otherwise it's going to be 2 weeks of no work and lots of cats and seeing family. So I'm really looking forward to this, which means there will not be a Cup of Cosmology for the next 2 weekends because I will be traveling. So let me just bring up calendar because I do not have dates in my mind. There is going to be no Cup of Cosmology on the 25th, no Cup of Cosmology on the 1st of September. The 8th of September is still an open question because it is very close to me traveling back. And as I mentioned, I am chronically ill. Sometimes after traveling, I need a few days to recover. So the 8th of September is a question mark. It will very much depend on how I'm feeling. But the following week, the 15th of September, there will definitely be a Cup of Cosmology. So there's going to be a few weeks break. There's plenty of old episodes you can watch in the meantime. You can go rewatch the highlights. There's some playlists called highlights that you can go rewatch. And then in September, I potentially have 2 guests lined up. More to come. But there's going to be some fun stuff happening. But there is going to be a break. I'm taking a break from work, taking a break from academia. And then taking a break from Cup of Cosmology for 2 weeks, to potentially 3 weeks. Will there be any beautiful Scandinavian train rides? Not this time. This time I am actually flying. I am flying down to Barcelona, staying there for 2 weeks, and then flying home. I had considered doing some of this journey by train because I love traveling by train. Initially, this trip was actually booked on very short notice and the trains were just not available. And then I rescheduled the flights, and at that point, it didn't make sense to cancel a flight to book some trains instead. So only flying this time. So no pretty Scandinavian train rides, but I do get to fly over the Pyrenees, which is always fun. Yes, I see some people saying here that I should have because I will be with a lot of cats, I should do a stream where I just introduce the cats. Yeah, that could be very chaotic and very fun. Cup of Cosmology with cats. That might become more of a thing going forward. We will see. We will see. But in any case, Cup of Cosmology will be back early to mid-September. Still unclear exactly when, but it will definitely be back in a few weeks. In the meantime, there are plenty of old streams you can watch. I'm going to make a note to look up the black hole thing. It may or may not happen, but as you know, I may or may not pick up this notebook again for the next few weeks. Yes, an episode on cats could be next week. Yes, the thing is, I don't take all my setup with me, so it would be like bad camera, bad microphone, laptop, but it would have cats. So maybe we can do cat Cup of Cosmology at some point. We'll see. We'll see about that. No guarantees, no promises just yet. You took a train through Norway this summer, and it was one of the highlights of the year. Yeah. Trains through Norway through Sweden are absolutely gorgeous. There are some amazing views. I've done a few trains through Norway and Sweden. Absolutely gorgeous. Very much recommend doing that if you have a chance. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here today. I know this stream was different to what I usually do. Usually it's much more science focused, but I think it's really important to talk about the whole atmosphere around academia as well. I hope you learned something about how academia works. And to any academics watching, I hope you're not completely demoralized by talking about this, but if you're an academic, you already know everything I talked about today anyway. So yeah, science is great. Cup of Cosmology is on a 2-week break, and then we'll be back as normal, back in September with some highlights. Thank you everyone for being here today. This has really been great fun. It's been really nice to have everybody here and to see all your comments and your discussions of your own experiences inside and outside of academia. It's been really, really fun. I think this is the record for the longest Cup of Cosmology I've done, 1 hour, 42 minutes. This is definitely a record. So thank you everyone for being here. This has been great fun. Cup of Cosmology will be back in a few weeks. I hope to see you all then. And I hope in the meantime, you all take care of each other and stay curious.